Citizen Talks is a podcast series featuring discussions with humanitarians, activists, artists, and changemakers, exploring the global humanitarian issues that shape our society, the world at large. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Citizen Talks. I am your host, Minkailu, and we are joined today by Zulaikha Patel. She is an activist, author, speaker, and social entrepreneur based in South Africa. Zulaikha, thank you so much for being with us here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I always like to start by giving our audience a little brief about yourself if they're not familiar with you. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
My name is Zulaikha Patel. I am a South African anti-racism activist, author, speaker, as well as a social entrepreneur. My story is not one that is quite unique because I am a South African that was born post-1994, which everybody knows 1994 was when democracy dawned upon South Africa. And I form part of a generation called the Born Frees in South Africa. We're the people that were born after what everyone calls the dawn of democracy and when freedom dawned upon South Africa. And when I say my story is not unique, is that I live through the same experience as many other born frees in South Africa. And so what I mean by that is born frees, people that were born into a country deemed as free globally, but a country where the remnants of the then oppressive apartheid regime are still deeply attached to the fiber of our country. And we find ourselves trapped in systemic racism and institutionalized racism as well. And my story begins as a girl who was born from an interfaith and an interracial family. I was born to an immigrant Indian father who is Muslim. He came from Karmad in India. And I was also born to a black Ndebele South African mother who has a Christian background. And my parents met in the late 90s, got married in the early 2000s, also had me in the early 2000s. And I was born only 8 years into democracy. At that point in time, South Africa had not entirely warmed up to the idea of interracial marriages, especially interracial marriages where these are between the Black and Indian community, because apartheid was such an insidious system that sought to separate people, not just solely on the basis of black or white, but also separate people between, we all know the history of separation from white, African, black, colored, and Indian, and draw lines, deep lines of division. And with those deep lines of division came stereotypes about everybody else, and also came them digging on the one side with people that are black people, people who are united in oppression against racism, driving deep, insidious anti-blackness. And so I grew up in a time when it was not the norm for a black South African woman to marry an Indian man, because there was a deep sense of division that was drawn between the two, and a deep sense of anti-blackness, which on the one end, it was not acceptable for an Indian man to marry a black woman because of what the apartheid regime sowed into society. And this is important in my story because I would not be the Zulaikha that everybody has come to know of if it wasn't for my upbringing, where because of my identity, I experienced and found myself trapped in institutionalized and systemic racism and the day-to-day racism that exists in South Africa because it's still attached to the fiber of our country. And I remember vividly that my first introduction into knowing what racism is happened when I was 5, when my dad took me to a community that is a predominantly Indian community, and everybody asked him, "Who's the black girl you came with? Why is her hair like that?" And everybody made fun of my hair. And this was primarily because of the blackness that exists in my identity. And from that point on, I began to understand the complexity of my identity and its positioning in South Africa. And so as a child, I then went to schools that were former segregated schools, former white-only schools, which are schools in your predominantly suburban, urban areas, which are called former Model C schools. So I went to those schools because my parents both grew up in poverty and so deemed those schools as prestigious, as we want these opportunities for our children. And so when I went into those schools, I then encountered institutionalized racism. And I encountered the reality of South Africa that just because apartheid ended constitutionally, that doesn't mean the entire system and what that system came with has been annihilated. And at 13, I started a movement against institutionalized racism called Stop Racism at Pretoria High School for Girls, where I spoke up against racist hair policies in the high school that I went to, which prohibited black girls from wearing afros, basically having your hair naturally as it grows as an African person.
So it's to the level of policy around hair.
Yes, hair policy. Policy around identity and the expression of identity, because it was a girls' school and they also prohibited the use of speaking in African languages. You could only converse in English, even in your personal conversations outside of the classroom. You could only converse in English. And at the time, because I had lived my entire childhood knowing what racism is and knowing that this is wrong deeply and that South Africa still has such a long way to go as a country, I then knew I wanted to contribute to changing that. And that's when I started that movement and where my activism all started. And that became a global conversation around institutionalized racism, around solidarity, around the expression of Black identity and how Black identity continues to still be policed, and there's always a sense of control over how you should express yourself or how you should wear your hair. And that started very much needed discourse in society globally at large, and very much needed discourse in South Africa. And nearly 10 years ago, that's where my activism started. And I knew from that point on, I wanted to form part of changing the world essentially and form part of advocating for an anti-racist world. So ever since then, I've continued with my activism, and then that then birthed writing children's books that are empowering, and then starting a non-profit organization that seeks to uplift children in rural communities in South Africa through setting up libraries in rural disenfranchised schools in South Africa. And that's where it all started. And that's an introduction into who I am.
Yeah. So I want to sort of dig into this issue a little bit more, because obviously the nature of racism in South Africa is extremely nuanced in a lot of ways. Probably more so than in many other countries, because it was such a strong codified, policy of the country for many, many years. So apartheid ends 30 some odd years ago. Where you are today, what is the nature of the hierarchy of race in relation to power in South Africa? Like, what are the systems, what are the structures of these systems like that are keeping people in their places, specifically, I guess?
That is such a deep question with such a lengthy answer, because when you look at what happened to South Africa was essentially a country that was dominated and conquered by white colonial conquest for maybe 400 years ago, and for so long as well, because South Africa had two, it's very unique to other African countries because it had two forms of colonial oppression. There was colonization that happened in the Cape with the Dutch, and then the British, administrating colonization through the Dutch. And then what also was introduced in that period, the Land Act that came in around the early 1900s, 1913, they introduced the Land Act, and that then started the process of how South Africa also became a country where our land was occupied by others and the land was stolen from indigenous South Africans. And then you have 1948 where apartheid is introduced formally. But prior to 1948, it's not like the country was not under some form of colonial rule. The country was under colonial rule. And from 1948, then the apartheid regime develops and starts to introduce insidious racist acts, begins to segregate society deeply. And the reason why I'm taking you back to this is because there are some really pivotal things that happened then that still affect society then to date. So for example, post 1948, they then started to introduce acts where interracial marriages were then prohibited.
Yeah.
And that came in affecting society where even after 1994, after the end of apartheid, to date, people still frown upon interracial marriages. It's still difficult to even, as a South African, if you know that you are in a relationship with someone that is of a different race and you're going to go have that conversation with your folks that you're going to marry someone of a different race, it's still a conversation that is such a heavy one because of how people's minds were affected. Apartheid was such an insidious system that not only affected people physically based on their lives, but affected the rewiring of people's minds as a whole.
Right.
And then there was the introduction of the Bantu Education Act, which people know mostly through learning about the 1976 uprising by the high school students that sought to change education for Black South African children, where the Afrikaans was then made the medium of instruction and Black children were given a more inferior form and quality of education. So the Bantu Education Act, which then created segregation of schools. White schools were given more funding. There was more that the government invested into an education of a white child than the education of a Black child. And the education of a Black child was also one that was inferior, where under apartheid, a Black child went to school to learn how to become a laborer, to learn how to come back to work for the white man. Right? You had subjects like woodwork. You had subjects like sewing. I know my mom did woodwork at school, so that shows you how insidious that system was. And they then segregated society, not just solely on the basis of race between white and Black, but separating society and digging deep lines of division beyond just white and Black, separating society from white, Black, colored, Indian, and then amongst Black people, then separating us according to cultural groups and digging deep lines of division and tribalism. And this created such a divided society. And when you look at South Africa today and how racism and what are the current nuances of racism and the hierarchy of power, is that all of this was done over the period from 1948 up until the late 80s, because from the period of the 80s, South Africa then started a process of transformation because it was forced to. There was then conversations around negotiations beginning to happen. So all of this was done so deliberately to dig in deep lines of division. And so post 1994, when apartheid comes to an end legally and it's no longer constitutionalized, that doesn't mean that all the remnants of that system have been annihilated and what was sewed into the fiber of the country disappears. Because after 1994, now the governing party, the African National Congress, comes into power. Nelson Mandela becomes president, and you now have a Black government, and South Africa is no longer ruled by the racist white regime. That doesn't mean everything fell away. What happens is that when you look at the current hierarchy of power in South Africa, is that the government is Black, but that doesn't mean that the government has economic power as well. To date, majority of South Africa's land remains privately owned. It's not like when apartheid ended, everybody who suffered the loss of land, the stealing of land as a result of colonization and apartheid got their land back. Land is still a conversation to date in South Africa, and a conversation that hasn't really moved beyond being a conversation. It's not like there is land that has been expropriated back to people who lost their land as a result of colonization and apartheid. So the land in South Africa remains majority private owned, majority private white owned, including everything that's underneath the land. The mineral wealth in South Africa also is not something owned by the state, and is ultimately not something owned by the people as well. And so the hierarchy of power is that in South Africa, we are politically free. Everyone now has the right to vote. We don't have a racist system that is in the legislation that separates and segregates society, and we have a black government as well, but that doesn't mean the power has been given back. Power remains privatized, and in South Africa, everything that's privatized means it's white owned, right, and largely foreign white owned. So economic power has not come back to the state. South Africa's hierarchy of power is we as a nation are just politically free. Economically, we're not free. And everything that has been sowed into the country, you still see the remnants of it present to date. You still go into the country, and on bird's eye view, you can see the inequality that exists. You can see how areas that were created to segregate black people from urban areas exist to date with the very same challenges that existed back then. You go into a place like Soweto, a township, and you go into many other townships in the country, and you look at the quality of life in a township and the quality of life in an urban, suburban area. We have townships where to date electricity, running water, having schools where the quality of education there is the same as the quality of education in an urban area. There is still deep inequality whereby we still have rural communities that are left behind whilst the rest of the country progresses forward. And so power largely still has a face in the country, where economic power in the country has a face, which is not black, it is a white minority. Because to date, in the country, poverty has a face, which is black, and wealth has a face, which is white. So that's the power hierarchy currently in South Africa. And the nuances of racism are present in how the country still has a geospatial divide as well.
Yeah. So much of Africa, I believe, still suffers through maybe not outright colonialism today, but neo-colonial economic policies, resource extraction, land ownership problems, these kinds of things that you mentioned. And as you say, they're still around very much so, and they are quite frankly responsible for the inequality that you see from a poverty perspective, right? So in your mind, as a young South African who is part of the new generation, what would be the best resolution to these neo-colonial economic issues? What can be done to solve these problems? Because they're big problems and they're very deeply rooted in the history of the country. So what would you like to see happen to resolve that?
You know, as a young South African, it's quite a tough question to pose, because as a young South African, I also form part of a group of South Africans who also have deep societal issues that we're currently facing, because we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, particularly youth unemployment rate. And so there's so many new nuances to consider as well before you can say there's a resolution to this all. But as an African nation that has experienced land theft like many others, and that has experienced the system that segregated society so deeply that you still see that to date, I truly believe that as a nation in South Africa, one of the first conversations we need to be having is why so much of our land is privately owned, and who are the private owners of that land, and why so many state state-owned entities also have private ownership as well. And one of the reasons why I believe that the land in South Africa is better off being state-owned and nationalized than it is privately owned, because then the state would be able to expropriate land and would be able to expropriate land back to people. Whereas if it's privately owned, you can't do that, and you are held back by the private ownership of that land. And so one of the biggest things in South Africa that I think would change so much is land, because land represents wealth. It represents more than it just being, oh, I have a couple of hectares of land. Land is also a sense of financial stability as well, because land feeds people. People are able to farm with the land. Land is also a sense of identity as well. And so many people, because of the history of the Group Areas Act in South Africa that moved people away from where they were from and segregated people, so many people's identities, if land would be expropriated, it's a sense of identity. And so one of the biggest things that I believe in as a young South African is the issue of land. And I think that beyond land, because that's also such a complex one, and it's one that would take years to resolve, one of the other things that I believe would be a great resolution into some of the racial issues that South Africa still faces is there needs to be more political will from our government to ensure that the livelihood of a Black person is something that they're able to ensure that the livelihood is improved. Because in South Africa, when you're born into poverty, it's very difficult to get out of the cycle of poverty. You're stuck in a perpetual cycle of poverty. And from what I've seen through the work that I do with my organization is there needs to be more political will to improve the lives of Black people in townships and rural areas, and tangibly improve them through healthcare, the quality of education, the quality of healthcare, the quality of life, opportunities also being afforded, right? Because one of the biggest barriers to success within these communities is the barrier that lies between you and opportunity, and also undoing the many fibers of exclusion that were sown in. You know, for example, I went to, in South Africa, what is deemed as prestigious schools growing up, and the darkness behind these prestigious schools and going to them as a young Black South African is that you find yourself trapped in deep institutionalized racism, because you're now going into an environment where this environment was not initiated with the thought that you would one day form part of it. Everything about this environment was built without the idea that you would one day form part of it. For example, the high school I went to. The high school I went to, when it was established primarily only for white girls. There was no thought that one day a girl that looks like me is going to form part of this environment one day. So the policies are built on exclusion. That's how I ended up going into a school where in 2016, you have an African school that has banned afros and dreadlocks, braids, any expression of Black identity. That's how I ended up being in such an environment, because that environment was not built that one day people who look like me are going to form part of it. So there needs to be a greater sense of political will behind undoing policies of exclusion, ensuring that to date there isn't a South African school, public school, that exists where a Black child will enter it and they feel that they're at war with their identity, because their identity, the policies of that institution don't allow for their identity to exist in it. Right. So ensuring that we actually have policies that protect Black identity in these institutions, ensuring that institutions have anti-racist policies. So I think as a country, we still need to do the focus work of ensuring that we still strive for an anti-racist South Africa. That work should have never stopped in the late 90s. It should have continued up until we see the tangible effect of it.
Yeah. So to something that you were just speaking about and previously as well, when you have colonization, excuse me, is so insidious because it's not just a physical means of control, but also a psychological one. So in terms of the psyche of the modern South African, how much of the issues that you see around race, inequality, etc., are related to an instilled sense of self-hatred amongst the different racial groups that you have in the country?
So much of it is so psychological as well, because at times because you are growing up and the system of oppression was not that long ago. Essentially, my generation was raised by people who lived under that system of oppression.
Yeah.
And because my generation is one that was raised by people who lived under that system of oppression, who under that system were made inferior, there's always this looming sense of inferiority that always hangs over their head, which they instill in the next generation that they raise. I mean, as a Black child, I've seen it. You sometimes are taught to be timid. You sometimes are taught this sense of inferiority, to be timid, to never speak back, to white people as well. I remember as a child, one of the things that I fought with my grandmother, for example, about was, I remember she would say to me, "Don't speak back to white people." And I was like, but what is this thing of having to be so compliant that I can't even defend myself and say, no, you're pronouncing my name incorrectly, and you should pronounce it correctly, and you're going to try again and again and again until you get it right. And small things like that are how people were taught that they're inferior, and this was sewn in psychologically that it's so difficult to undo it, and there's this deep sense of self-hatred that is also passed on to the next generation. And small things like, you're not even taught that you can correct a white person when they pronounce your name incorrectly. That's seen as defiant as well. And there's this sense of superiority that sometimes is also taught to white people. I mean, when I look at when I was growing up in school with my fellow white counterparts, there was always this sense of superiority that they felt. There was always this deep sense of, I'm better than you, or I'm entitled to this. That was something that was ingrained in them, that if you defended yourself, you were seen like you are trying to harm someone, or it was seen as you are misbehaving. You can't do that. And there was this deep sense of superiority that was something that was ingrained in them. So much of it is so psychological in South Africa. And I believe it's because just because the laws changed, people didn't change.
Right.
People didn't change as well. And we are dealing with a system that educated people on superiority, inferiority, that drew these lines of division. And as a society, we're not so focused on the mental aspect of undoing all of that as well. And so it's quite insidious as well when you think about it. And even just thinking about my personal upbringing, growing up between two identities, between two worlds that were divided.
Right.
Growing up and seeing, for example, in the Indian community, anti-blackness was taught in the Indian community as a result of apartheid, because apartheid made Indian people more superior to black people, but also inferior to white people. And you see it in how, when I was growing up, the only primary reason why so many Indian people didn't like me or felt that I don't fit in their community was because a part of my identity represents blackness, and it represents something that you were taught to see as inferior. And so much of it is psychological as well. But I do see that the current generation of millennials and Gen Z, especially Gen Z, because in South Africa, the millennials, we tend to call them the first trial run generation. They were the first ones to live in a South Africa that is not segregated, enter spaces that were historically segregated. So they're more of the trial run, and they never thought they could have much of a voice as well, because they were like the trial run generation as well, because some of that, as a black person, they were taught that you had to be grateful that you're in this environment. And so when I look at Gen Z especially, we aren't as psychologically wired the way other generations are wired. You know, I see the change that when I look at my fellow Gen Z black young South Africans, nobody thinks of themselves as inferior. Nobody thinks they have to be timid. Nobody thinks they can't speak up for themselves or speak back or speak up against racism. And so I see that it's changing with every new generation that comes.
Right. So you yourself are the author of several children's books dealing with issues of race, identity, etc. Was that one of your objectives, to sort of change this psychology around these particular issues?
When I knew that as an activist, I have to also write books, because books play such an integral role in rewriting the narrative, I knew I wanted to write books for children first before I wrote adult books, because children are the future. And I believe if you can change something with children, then you can definitely rewrite what the future is going to look like, and it won't look like the present currently. And so I knew that I wanted to write children's books where Black identity is represented positively, not just to only empower Black African children to feel empowered when they are able to see themselves in my books, because being able to see yourself in a book and representation is something that empowers your existence. It empowers you as an individual. But I also wanted to write books where everybody else would see the beauty of an identity that has never been represented positively, and see that this identity is not inferior as well. I knew with my first children's book that I wrote about African hair, which is an ode to afros, which is an ode to hair that has always been deemed as unruly, as inferior, as ugly. I knew I wanted to write a book that would empower Afro hair, and the story behind it would not be one of feeling inferior and not loving your hair. I knew I wanted to write a book where all of humanity would see that hair that looks like mine is not inferior, and it's more than just hair for a person that's like me. It's my identity, it's my sense of heritage, it's ancestry. It's more than just hair for me, and they would be able to see that through the story that I've written, and that in turn they're able to respect hair that looks like mine. And with my journey of writing books, the people I initially wrote the books for, I've gotten more support as well. I've seen white parents purchase my books for their children, not because they're going to see themselves in my book, but because they're going to see an identity which in society has been portrayed as an inferior identity, and them seeing that identity represented in the way that it's represented in my books, in turn makes them believe that it's not inferior, makes them believe that there's significance behind this identity. And so I knew I wanted to write children's books for the advancement of humanity as a whole.
So we are unfortunately getting to the end of our time here. Before we go, I would love to ask you if you have any final thoughts, any words that you would like the audience to leave this conversation with.
We just spoke about the books, so I guess the final thoughts could be about the books, particularly about my newly published book, Brave Like Me, which is a children's book, which is a memoir about my story.
Can we get a look for the camera here to take a look at the book? We have it here live. Yes,
so that's me. And Brave Like Me, I believe, is a special book because it represents so much, and it has so many layers to it as well. It's not just the story of Zulaikha Patel and how she found her voice and became an activist. It's a story that empowers children to be brave, because bravery has no age, no size, no affiliation, and anyone can be brave. And that the world is changed by ordinary people who are brave enough to believe that they can, and are brave enough to stand for something and speak up for something. And so beyond it being a book to empower children to be brave voices of change and activists, the representation in the book, I think that it is so vital and important that people get to see an Indian man in the book, a black woman, a family that is an interracial family positively represented, because we don't talk about that enough. And people are able to see that my family isn't one that is strange, or the ideas that people tend to have about interracial families. And I hope that people who have families like mine and have always felt a sense of not feeling like they belong anywhere, or that their families are strange because they look different, find a sense of healing from reading my book and seeing positive representation of a family that looks like theirs.
Amazing. And if they want to connect with you, keep track of what you're working on, where can they do that?
On social media, on Instagram, Zulaikha Patel _, on LinkedIn, Zulaikha Patel.
Amazing. Okay. Zulaikha, thank you so much for being with us here today. We really appreciate your time. And for all of our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Citizen Talks, and we will see you next time.